Good morning. We continue the conclusion, summary, review of Ayin Beis from volume 3, closer to the bottom of page 1469. So there are two, well, I would say it's one theme, but there's two concurrent threads here that the Rebbe Rashab is discussing. One is the very hisbonenus. What is the contemplation on Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and Baruch Shem, the contemplation of the divine unity, the Yachid is Baruch, like he said on page 1466, which is the central Yesod. He called it the Yesod of all the mitzvahs. A mitzvahs hayichud delikus, yichud ilah, yichud tata, sevav klam, amal klam, and how they are joined together, which is Yesod kol ha-mitzvahs, as he put it. So what does that contemplation consist of? So overall, we're in the middle of discussing. First thing is to understand and appreciate God, of course. So if existence has something in common with God, and it's not really accurate because God is beyond existence, you're not going to have a true yichud. So the yichud, meaning the unification and integration of the two, is an appreciation of what God really is. And as we're going to learn, that will lead us to be able to create this yichud, this connection, or this internalization and integration. So he discusses the difference between yesh ma'ayin and yesh miyesh, where everything in existence is yesh miyesh, il v'al, cause and effect, and 2 points. They're commensurate to each other, there's something in common, and it causes a shinui hispilus one to the other. As we discussed, those 2 points are interdependent. When it comes to creation, the Biy'a and the nivra, there's nothing in common among them. It's yesh ma'ayin, that's why you call it ayin. It's a different reality. And indeed, therefore, also does not have any shinui and hispilus on the Biy'a, on the Creator. And he explained that with the concept of oir, light. Because God created an entity called light, and light does not affect the source, nor is it affected by the place it's shining, as we explained. The light of the sun is the first example, then came a second example of the oir hanefesh. Okay, but then comes this twist. But the oir hanefesh, you actually have something that, an additional element, which is critical, because the fact is godliness also manifests within existence. And there you have to say there is some form of shinui and hispilus, because godliness wants to manifest and relate to existence and engage with it. Yes, doesn't have to, but that's what the Eibishter wanted. So the nefesh, you also have these two things. On one hand, you have the nefesh that remains apart from the body that it manifests in, and then there's the nefesh that's mislabish, like he said in the dam, the blood, which is the right keli, which is the ruchni shebegashmi, to manifest the gashmi sheberuchni of the nefesh. And there the nefesh is mispa'eles mimikri aguf. The nefesh, the spirit, is affected by the experiences of the body, as we learned on page 1466 and 1467 as well, where the Rebbe Rashab explained it with different examples, the different parentheses in the top paragraph. Okay. But the additional element that was introduced is that he already brought us back to the essential point that all this is the nefesh halikis contemplating in order to affect the nefesh habamis. So in the parentheses, especially in the bottom one, he spoke about that. I'm sorry, I said the wrong page numbers. Pages 1468 and 1469 is what we discussed what I just said. And then he said, as I said, that when the nefesh halikis manifests the nefesh habamis, it also has two elements. There's the part that they speak to each other, and nefesh halikis is mislabish, like we learned earlier, kimahus echad, becomes like one personality. That's how close it is. That's why the seichel of the nefesh halikis is able to speak when it comes into a body and into animal soul. The language, what he said, the seichel hativi of the nefesh habamis. So that's how how they connect to each other, and it has an impact, and a direct, like, engaging impact. Excuse me. And then there's the higher part of the nefesh that remains above what he called the mazel sheba neshama, that is more behelim and makif, that you don't feel a conscious relationship with it, but it still has an effect, what he called mamayla lamato. And then there's different levels of the effect that one has on the other. So the avarab of the nefesh elikis has an effect on causing a hapcha chashech on the hera, but it's mamayla lamato because it's not necessarily the level that's engaging. So bottom line is, which makes sense, the nefesh elikis can speak to the nefesh habamis, but it still retains a certain, nefesh elikis. It's still not the nefesh habamis. It is a divine soul, whereas the nefesh habamis is not. One more point, when he spoke about the two levels, he also made it clear that it's not sufficient to say that it's just neshamas of Biy'a that engage with the nefesh habamis down below, and the neshamas of Atzilus sheba Biy'a, or Atzilus itself, remain removed, because they too are, even though they're called Evdei Hashem b'nishmasam, they serve God b'neshama, they too are involved with birudim, like the difference between Shabbos and Chayil, but they too are involved with birur v'tikun aguf nefesh habamis. However, obviously, it's not quite the same way, the way the neshamas of Biy'a. And he said, the neshama, therefore, they too have the neshama as a mismelua beguf, which he calls nara nefesh ruach neshama. But the bechinish neshama shel amayla mislapshus beguf is not nirgish beguf, is not felt by the body. So you see both levels. And then we returned in the bottom paragraph on page 1469, which we learned in the last class. The Dugma Mekolzeh will also understand the Neshama Klalis, which means the divine Neshama that creates all of existence. That there are also these two levels. There's the level that's removed, but now he's talking about the level that's mislabish koyach hapel benifel, he called it. The power of the producer in the product. That's the lesson. That's a lesson from the Mittler Rebbe that the Rebbe Rashab cites. So in the third line of the new paragraph, and now he's going to bring proof that there's a shinavi spilus from different psukim, and continue to explain these two levels of the divine that manifest within existence. Now, obviously, you could already speculate. Well, it's more than speculate. You could understand that ultimately the goal is to create yichud, which means that we should have God, experience of God on God's terms. That's leishanisi, that's completely beyond shinui. But in a world of shinui, in a world where the body and the animal soul and the physical world relates to it. So that's why you have godliness, a level of godliness that is mamal kalam, and that manifests within existence. And there's a level of godliness that transcends existence. That is clearly where he's leading here. And that's pretty straightforward from what we're learning now. But he's going to spell all this out as we go along. So now in the third line, essentially 6 lines from the bottom of page 1469, Aleph Tov Samach Tes. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. U'kamoisha Kosav. He's bringing now proof, and this is the Mittler Rebbe's language. Like it says in the Pasuk, Machtu li Chosed Aleph. So usually you would translate what's machtu? Usually it's mechete with a mechete, like a chet, that it was a sin to me, but it's missing an aleph. So he says shahu kemachat bebasad achai, because when you take out the aleph from chet, what do you have left? Machat. Machat is a needle, so it's like a piercing needle, like when you stick a needle into a living thing and it creates pain. So Machtuli, basically God is saying that when we experience pain or when we do something that's inappropriate, it's like as if we're stabbing God. How could you say such a thing? So obviously it's kavyachol, but it means there's a level of godliness that is directly impacted, that the tsar below creates a tsar above. Like we spoke before about the pain of the body creates tsar, the mikri aguf, in the soul, in the nefesh. Ukamaimer dechik ragli hashchina. Another Maimer Chazal that indicates the same idea, that when a person does something wrong, dechik ragli hashchina literally means you're like causing the legs of the shchina. It's like somebody creating a stumbling block and causing somebody to fall. So dechik ragli hashchina, you're talking about the shchina here. And yet we're applying again this type of, obviously it's all anthropomorphic, meaning it's not a physical sense, but it's all mishalim, but it is indicating on an effect. You can't call this not shina and spilus when you use words like that, like doch kuragli ashchina or machtuli, like a machat. Ukiyadua, and the Rebbe Rashab explains, sha'idea avenus, again, this is the language of the Mittler Rebbe. That's known, that through sins, through transgressions, nasa pagamim lamayla, we actually create wounds, a pagam, a wound, an injury above. So here we clearly see that our behavior has a direct impact. That's what's called shina in ispilus. Just like human relations, if you do something to hurt someone someone else, it hurts them. It's not like they're aloof or detached and oblivious. So however you explain it in Ruchnius, but the bottom line is we use terms that this create pagamim lamaylo. Shezeu b'bchinas evarim d'shchinta. Where is this taking place? Called the shchina. Enochanami, it's not in the lakus in the higher levels. It's an evarim d'shchinta. Remember, we learned about the evarim d'shchinta by Ramach Mitzvah Sesa. The 248 positive mitzvahs are called evarim d'malka. They're called the organs of the king. We also spoke about the 248 letters, Ramach Tevis rather, words in Shema, also connected to that. So we clearly see that even though this is all metaphorical, but you do use the word evarim. And that's where the avenis create a wound. It's like creating an injury in the evarim of the king. Ukmei eini Hashem, oznei Hashem. Like we find in the Torah expressions, the eyes of God, the ears of God. So again, it's metaphorical, but you're still using those terms. Shehein malachim shenikroim evri d'shchinta. They're the malachim that are called evri d'shchinta, like the limbs and organs of the shchina. So, essentially, a malach is a. We used the example earlier, like a minister. But if you go deeper, it's more than that. It's like the instruments of the king, and he's calling it now. He's actually associated with the evarim themselves. Commission is barely ill. Let me just see. I wanted to just see one thing. I didn't remember. Okay, I quote bottom of page 1408 is where he said that. Oh, okay. Yeah. There he referred to the eyes. The malachim are like the eyes of the king. They are like the supervisors. But you could interpret it that they are like outside entities. But here he's clearly saying they are like God's eyes. Mored ashguchusa, like Klea Ayin. Right. The 7 levels of the also, I wrote page 1425. I'm just looking up what it says earlier. I want to just refresh myself a moment. Page 1425. Eine Hashem, yeah. There you also remember he used the word the digestive system and so on. So what does that mean? It means that it's part of God's cosmic order. So obviously we're not talking about godliness that's before the structure or that's beyond the structure, but within the structure, there is the expression, God's structure, the divine structure, which includes eyes and ears, like he said, evarim. And that's where the avenis create a pkam. They can create a wound, an injury there. The ha'oras ha'malchus, idea parsa, that this is referring to the reflection of malchus that comes through the parsa, the partition between Atzilus and Biy'a, shebein Atzilus leBiy'a, between Atzilus and Biy'a, mislabeshes behem. So as we learned, where the Malachim get their energy from, where do they come from? It's the reflection of Malchus. After the Parsa that creates this structure, we'll call it we call the cosmic support system, but now he's calling it the Evarim, the Malka. So that level of Maharsa Malchus is mislabeshes behem. And that's where there's the impact, the Shin and Ispilus of the Avenus, like he said. Vehain, and now he's summing up what we had learned earlier. Vehain b'chinas keiches alikim memutzayim, and these are the divine faculties, divine powers that serve as interfaces or memutzayim, intermediaries. Lahamshich hashefa me'elam la'elam, to transmit and draw down the flow, the divine flow from one world to the next. Vehain b'chinas kelim achitzenim, and they are called the outer containers, which we also just learned back a while back, that they're the outer containers. They're like the outer instruments, you could say, the channels, the delivery, the distribution system. That's what the Malachim role is. So in the human body, like we discussed with the digestive system, these parts of the body are not the etzem nefesh, but they're an extension. They carry the energy of the soul into every part of the body. So the same thing with Ruchnius. In the Seder Ishtalshelus, this level of Evarim de Malka, which he's referring to the Malachim now, are the carriers and the distributors, and so they are part of the king. They're the Evarim of the king. They're the limbs and organs, but they're obviously not. The king is himself higher than that. So that's the level he's talking about. Okay, so that's the level where there is a Shini V'Yispilus. We're still in the middle, so let's see where he's going with this. Aval Mesitra de Shchina, Omar, but from the perspective, Mesitra de Shchina means Sitra is like the side. From the perspective of the Shchina, which is higher than its Mislabeshes. Here we're talking about the Shchina as it's coming down into Biy'a, into the Malachim, and carrying that flow. But when you talk about Sitra Shchina, Omer ki loyde isim kol tmuna de Adam. There the pasuk says, you will not see any image, any human image there. Here we just refer to God as He manifests in an image. Yes, in a spiritual image, but spiritual structure. But He does say eyes, ears, evarim, ragle hashchina, the legs of the Shchina. But the Shechina itself, meaning before it manifests within the reflection of Malchus, after the Parsa, the partition, and goes into Biy'a, that's where you say, V'hainu b'chinas Malchus Atzilus, because that's referring to Malchus Atzilus, K'moishi B'Atzilus, Terem Shemis Labeshes B'Biy'a. Next page, 1470. Prior or before it manifests in Biy'a. So even though Malchus is the root and source of Biy'a in Atzilus, because Malchus is carrying Atzilus and is the power of revelation Atzilus that's going to carry that creative power into Biy'a. Like we learned earlier, like he explained earlier, we explained that the Malchus in every Sfira, that's where the Malchus in every Sfira, the Malchus Shebechachma, Malchus Shebebina, Malchus Shebechesed, etc., is the Koyach HaGili in the Sfira. V'chein, B'chinas HaMalchus B'chlal, that's the Malchus in each Sfira. So in other words, Malchus is the last and lowest level of each sphere, because it carries that sphere into the next level. So that's true. Nevertheless, and then there's the Malchus in general of Atzilus that carries all of Atzilus into Biy'a. So yes, indeed, it is the source, but on that level, the way the Koyach HaGili is still in Atzilus, not as it comes down after the Parsa, the partition that conceals and manifests in Biy'a, there's no Shinei V'Yispilus. Now this is something we learned earlier as well, when we talked about where the tikla, where the wheel, the potter's wheel, If you may recall, on page 1429, if you go back to 1429, he discussed where is the Shini V'Ispailus from Maisa Tachtenim. So this idea that he's talking about, the effect that we have in a form of Shini V'Ispailus, effect on godliness, is all in the lower levels of Malchus as it manifests in Biy'a. But not the Malchus as it is in Atzilus. Okay, before I continue, let me take any questions. Again, he's in the middle of the topic, so we're not over yet. He's going to talk about these two different levels in Elikus. But still, if something needs clarification, I'm happy to clarify. So we're now on top of page 1470, fourth line. Are there any questions?
I'm trying to understand the this notion of the level of Malchus as it manifests into Biy'a. The way I'm trying to understand it as it relates to when we studied, can we have any hashpah, let's say a positive hashpah on the Eibishter, and we also in that context talked about Malchus as, let's say, the mamutza, the interface between Biy'a and higher levels of godliness. So is this the same Malchus the same aspect of Malchus that is affected by sins or by misbehavior?
Exactly the same. That's the it's back on page 1429, actually 1428 he began. But on page 1428, 1429, he spoke about it at length. As I said, the potter's wheel. That's where he spoke.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah, that's where he discusses it more at length. And now he's talking about it in context of two levels of Elikus. Yeah. So if you go back page 1428, 1429, 1430, he discussed it there if you want more context.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now he says, V'hine ha-malachim de Biy'a, fourth line on page 1470. Now the malachim of Biy'a that we just referred to, shenivru mebchinas ha-kelim de Zun de Biy'a, who were created from the kelim of Zun of Biy'a. This again was all learned. We all discussed this more at length earlier, and he's connecting it back to there. There he was talking about it as the siyu of the malachim, because the neshama comes down below, and that's where they need the malachim. 1 second. Okay. So they're created from the kelim of Zun of Biy'a, which in turn comes from the ha'ara of Malchus of Atzilus after the parsa, after the partition. Again, Siman Chav, the 20th section in Ageres HaKedesh in Tanya. The mezivug Zun, the Biy'a, from the zivug, from the union of Zon, Malchus, and Biy'a, nivru ma'ayin liyesh kol ha'nivroim v'neitzim v'nasim. Created ma'ayin liyesh, all the creations, all the notzim is yitzira, all those that are shaped, and all the nasim is asiyah. Basically, all the creations are bria, yitzira, and asiyah. So he calls them nivroim would be the creation, the creatures of bria, neitzim would be the creatures of yitzira, and nasim are the creatures of asiyah, which are really different levels of angels that exist in all those three worlds. But hem shayach shinu v'ispailus. That's where there could be a shinu and ispailus. So in a way, you can say something like this. If you use an example like a king, he lives in his palace, in the capital of his empire, but he sends his ministers and his governors and his representatives to different parts of the country or the different parts of his empire, and they have to engage with the people. The king himself is not engaging with them directly, but they are representing the king. They're not independent entities, God forbid. They're the shluchim and the messengers, the emissaries of the king, but it's with them that you're engaging with. So if you have a complaint or you have something positive, there'll be that engagement. And that's where there'll be a shini and a spouse, because they relate to you and you relate to them. It's a very basic example just to give a sense. Now, obviously, God cares, and He's the one that sends them, and they obviously bring the message back. But the question, when you say the word shinui, like we said, we want to retain that God, that we have a relationship even with the God that's beyond the mutable shifts and changes, the fluctuations, if you wish, of existence. So this is one of the ways it's explained, which is really comes back to the very theme of why is there a Seder Shtalshlus in the first place? Why do we need a Seder Shtalshlus? Why do we need the worlds, Atzilus, Biy'a, Asiya, the Spheres, Tzimtzum, Kav? God could have just said, I want existence. And that's it. He doesn't need any Mumutzayim. He doesn't need any instruments. It's not a human being that can't build a house without the tools. God is the source of everything. But as we've always discussed, and this is always a critical point for two reasons. One is He wanted to do it in a way that's logical to the logic that we can relate to. If God did it that way, it would be a complete miracle, and we have no way of understanding it. Yes, God created the world. By creating a shtalshlus, there's a logic to it. There's a process. Yes, we could also have been born. We don't need 9 months of pregnancy. You could just be born like Adam and Chava were created at 20 years old. But the process of pregnancy and growth and gestation and development is part of the logical system of existence. And the second point, maybe as important, if not more important, is that we can retrace the steps. These are stepping stones, like rungs on a ladder that allow us to grow from our existence, from Tachtenim, to get all the way up there. Without these steps, how would we do that? It would have to be a miracle, again, or God would have to be the one that lifts us up there. Imagine trying to go from the ground to heaven. You can't even climb to the second floor without steps. So we have Sulam Mutzav Arzer Resha Magia Shamaima. So God created a Seder Shtalshlus of stepping stones. Just like a child grows, Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel, 1 day old, 5 years old, 10 years old, Ben Eser, Ben Chamish Lemikra, Ben Eser Lemishna. So that is the general understanding that needs to always be remembered. Chassidus talks about it in a few places explicitly, but it's the undercurrent of so many ideas, including what we're learning here. Because you could say, 1 second here, if God is no Ani Hashem Leishanisi, why are we creating a whole state and a whole explanation? There's Shinui, because you want to have an engagement with God on our terms. And in our world, there is Shinui. In other words, you don't just want to talk to a God that's completely beyond. We want to talk to godliness that relates to us. Now, obviously, it's all one. That's the Echad, Hashem Echad. We're going to learn that even this lowest levels are one with Elikus that's higher than existence and higher than Shinui. But like we discussed, it's bringing the world of Leishan Isi, of the immutable God, into a world of Shinui. So that's why God created a whole Seder Shtalshlus and the Malachim and everything we're learning here. Eini Hashem and Ozni Hashem. Even the very statement when we say that He created the human being, B'Tselem Elokim. What does that mean? We know God is beyond the Tselem. As a matter of fact, it's the cardinal sin. You're not allowed to make anything in the divine image. Like one Jewish philosopher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, would challenge the students and say, where's the only place in Torah that God Himself transgressed the worst possible sin? The answer is when He created a human being. The second of the 10 commandments is you should not make a pesel. You should not create anything in the image of God. And God created something in the image of God. It's called the human being. So however you wrap your head around that, bottom line is that the human, but why did He have to do that way? Because the only place where there's a meeting place, there's nothing in common. If there were no Eser Spheres, how would our Eser Koiches connect to godliness? So therefore, God created something called a divine image. Yes, of course He's beyond image. He doesn't need it, He's not limited by it, He's not defined by it. Even when it's there, remember, God is not affected by the tzimtzum, as we're going to learn as well. But for our purposes, and for the purpose of being able to make sense of it, and also to be able to connect, so then God says, I created a chesed, so ma'ato chanun, ma'hu chanun, afato chanun, ma'hu rachum, afato rachum. So now we have a path to follow. God says, just as I'm kind, you be kind. Just as I'm compassionate, you be compassionate. So that's where there's the meeting point where we meet, the mamutzoim that He's describing. So all of this is part of the process. And yes, on that level, kavyachol, so to speak, there is a shinei v'spailas because it's a godliness that relates to us. And therefore, our mitzvahs and our avainis can both cause pleasure and it can cause pain. Like he said before, the lower level of the nefesh, that manifests within the blood, within the body. But the higher level, as we're going to learn, is not affected, which is all part of the Isbananus. Because that's what we want. We want to ultimately come to the point that even the divine that relates to us and is affected, ultimately, really, when you really think about it, is all part of the godliness that's beyond it all. But this is not because God is aloof, because God is not defined by structures as we know them. But we can't arrive to that level of appreciation and understanding if we don't go through a level that we first relate. Like I always say in Aveda, before you talk about Sevav Kalam and how God is beyond being an artist and beyond providing us with life and sustenance, the first step is you have to teach yourself and your children. You ate a meal, make a bracha before you eat. God gave you food. You say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol niyeh b'dvarei, hamoitzi lechem min haaretz. At the end of a meal, you bench. Right? Hazonas hakoel. What are you saying? You're basically saying, I'm not just indulging as a self-contained reality and nothing else matters except me. I'm recognizing that God blessed me with life. All the bichas hashachar we say in the morning, thank you for allowing me to open my eyes, to walk upright, all the different, zekev kfufim, pekeich ivrim, etc. So we're recognizing the divine that is blessing us with life, with health, with all the faculties, with everything that we acknowledge. And someone will say, is that God? You'll say, that's what God is doing. That's how you relate to God initially. Then you come to realize, one second, God is not just a provider for me and my life and my sustenance. God is not just the artist that created the world. He's beyond being an artist. And he has many other aspects to him. And then you realize that even the part that he's providing us is also part of that higher reality. But you can't jump there if you don't first begin with a context, a relationship that has something that you can relate to, the koyach hapoel benifel, as he's calling it here. So all this is part of the bigger picture as we're going to learn. But right now he's discussing these levels. How
did you say it again? The koach hapol that what?
Benifel.
Relates to existence?
He used the word a few times. A koyach hapoel benifel. The power of the producer within the production. The slapshus of koyach hapoel benifel. He used it first at the end of the paragraph on 1468, and now he used it again at the bottom of 1469. It's like the level of the nefesh that manifests within the blood and that sustains us. And there, the nefesh is affected by the experiences of the body. Okay. Bottom line, the malachim of Biy'a are in the world of Biy'a. They're created from the zivug of Zun and Biy'a. There you could say Shini v'Ispilus. Hagam sheyesh b'ma'aris b'chinas Malchus. Even though, like we said, where do they get that energy? Where does it originate from? The reflection of Malchus from Atzilus after the parsa and the partition that concealed and the tzimtzum of the parsa that concealed. Mekom mokim shayich v'hem shinui. But now, once it's come down to this level, there is shayich shinui. There you could talk about shift, change, fluctuations. Like it says elsewhere. So there's in Chassidus talks about also in other places, there's in Oir and Koyach. So Oir literally means energy or light. But Koyach means a faculty. So Chassidus asks, what's the difference in Oir and a Koyach? They both come from the Nefesh. There's Oir HaNefesh and there's Koyach HaNefesh. Koyach is HaNefesh. The Bechinas Koyach u Bechinas HaKelim de Biy'a. Once it's become a faculty, now you're referring to the containers of Biy'a. That's where there's a shinui v'Ispilus, because the containers have now have given it body and shape, and that's where there can be shinui v'Ispilus. The kolshken, and if that's true with the koich kelim of Biy'a, the kolshken by malachim shenivru b'bchinas hakelim, and for sure the malachim that were created from the kelim, that you could speak about a shinui and v'Ispilus and effect on them. So very clearly, the Rebbe Rashab is connecting this to the discussions we had a lot earlier about the Malachim. There the discussion was more than a neshama comes down below, it needs a siyua, like the eye that manifests within the vision that manifests within the physical eye, cannot see in the dark, so it needs something to illuminate, some outside light. And the Malachim, the Birchis Yetzer that we say before Shema, is like the support that helps us come to the level of Shema. That's how we discussed it back then. That was the whole discussion with Malachim. Obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu was higher than the Malachim, but especially in Golus, we need Malachim, as we discussed at length. Here, he's clearly connecting it now to the difference between the Yichud Eloh and Yichud Tata. He's connecting it to the Elokus that manifests within existence, and that's where the Malachim, that's where they reside. That's their level. So it's interesting how he's bringing it all together. But that I'll elaborate more once we finish it, because I want to see how he develops this. And in truth, when we learned it the first time, I had not learned the Maimer HaMagbi, so a lot of this I taught, but I remember it was not with the same context that we have now, a bigger understanding of the Hisbonenus. So I'll elaborate on that as well, but I want to first read it all inside. Okay. So by the words, Mebchinas HaKelim. Are there any questions so far? Again, it's not finished yet, so
I had a question. Is anybody else? I don't want to keep going first if someone else has a question.
Maybe you're the only one that processes more than everybody. That's what's going on. It's not because they don't have questions.
Okay. Well, or maybe
I'm not saying that as a critique. I'm just saying it as an observation.
Oh, I'm being self-deprecating. Maybe I just talk too much. But
No.
my question is,
it's not your talk. I'll tell you what you're doing. You're doing what the thing that we had to carefully not do when we were chayzrim. You're processing more than absorbing. I'm just saying that's what's going on, and you are trying to understand it, which I fully understand why one does that. But the fact is, you really understand it more. But this is something you need to. It's training. It's a natural way many people do it. I mean, for the record, most people do that. They process before they fully absorb. So just keep in mind, again, I'm just saying it as a teacher to students here, not in any way criticizing the very thing that you're doing, because it's coming from a good place. It's coming from trying to understand it all. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's right. It's trying to understand it by juxtaposing it with other similarly related concepts. In this case, we hear in general in Yiddishkeit and Chassidus that if someone let's say sins, whatever, either they don't do mitzvah asa or they engage in a mitzvah los asa, I think we learned that it essentially creates a block in the channel. So there's a disconnect. So the sinner disconnects him or herself from these cords of godliness that are connected above. But it's one thing to disconnect from these avarim, if you will. It's another thing to cause change and hispilus in them. Now you could say, well, there is a hispilus or change because you're dafka disconnecting from them. But it seems to me when you disconnect,
so what do you mean by disconnecting? Who's disconnected? I didn't understand the disconnect. Who's disconnected from the?
We are. If I sin, if I God forbid, if whatever, I'm disconnecting myself from godliness. I can't even on the lower level, even on these Ivar Demalka. I'm withdrawing. I'm causing a disconnect in that flow or that connection of Elikus.
And in turn, that creates a disconnect in the lower level of Elikus too. That's the pain that causes.
Between the lower level of Elikus and the higher level of Elikus? Is that what you're saying?
Or in general, because God is like, it's like if your child disconnects from you, you're going to be in pain from that, right?
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you. See, that wasn't so hard. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, we still have to discuss the relationship between the higher level where there's no shinui and the lower level where there is. I totally agree, but he didn't get to that yet. Yeah, that's going to be, but that's
wasn't
another
my question.
Part of his discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
we're
wasn't
not
my
there yet.
question.
That
Yeah.
we didn't get to yet. The truth is, if you go back when he spoke about that the lower level as elikus, like dibur, when God manifests within godliness manifests within existence, it really is one with the godliness beyond existence. But in this
Right, that's
context,
the paradox. Yeah.
yeah, no, in this context now here, he hasn't gotten back to that. He will. This part
Yeah.
is in Ayin Beis. Before Ayin Beis concludes, he does get back to that. We'll see. We'll get there.
Yeah, see, I held off on that question. I'm learning. I had that question too. Like, how can you affect one level and not the other if they're really one and the same? That's a paradox.
But the logic that I would try to impress on you is this. If Ayin Beis stopped right here and there was no more pages to read, then I understand. Of course, we have no choice but starting to try to speculate what would be with all these things. But you see in front of you these pages. That means the Rebbe Rashab is going to say it. It's like when the Rebbe was saying a mimer, we wouldn't ask a question in the middle of the mimer, not just out of respect, because he's continuing to speak. Maybe he's going to answer it. So that's really what I'm trying to tell you.
I
That
get it. Yeah.
the fact is there are more pages here. So I understand the impatience or the enthusiasm to get it right away. But the fact is, he's building it in his own way, step by step. Now, after it all, if things are unclear, by all means, that's when we all have to really start delving. I mean, when did the essay I've been writing on the Hemshech Ayin Beis? When did I write it? After 13 years of teaching Ayin Beis. I would never have written that 13 years ago, or even 2 years ago. It's only when I had studied it all and I saw it all, and then I saw what was said and what was left unsaid, unspoken, so to speak, then I was able to start trying to piece it together.
Yes.
Anyway, just take it all part of the class. It's not
I don't
a
take it as
personal
I don't
thing.
take it as criticism. It's okay.
No, and I'm saying it not just to you. I'm saying it to myself, to everybody, because we all have this challenge. I also have this challenge, and sometimes I just either wait or I have to peek ahead. But often it doesn't work well because this itself is the process. The fact that Rebbe Rashab is not saying everything in one shot is because he's a good teacher and he's teaching it step by step.
Uh-huh.
And then by all means, the goal would be then sum it up in a way that it's all clear. So let's continue here. Now he says like this. For some reason, I don't remember the first time teaching this. The emphasis on the Malachim. I must have spoken about it when we learned it the first time. But it seems to be jumping out at me more than before. Okay, let me see why. V'hinei, and it says now like this. Hamalachim, these angels, the angels we're talking about here, Hanikroim Einei Hashem, Oznei Hashem. They're called the eyes of God, the ears of God, like the Evadim, like he said. Lefima shekosa b'tera er, b'dibur hamaskal erdana. I brought that pasuk yesterday, I think. So according to what it says in the Alter Rebbe Teira Er, the Maimers Vayera, it's called Erdana, where God says, let us descend and see where the cries of Sodom are coming from. So of course the big discussion, what do you mean God is descending? He's going down to that level, so to speak. Habez, the second Maimer, so there's two Maimerim there, Erdana, and the second one, Nira Shehen Malachim da Atzilus. Okay, interesting. Till now we've been talking that everything here was in Biy'a, not in Atzilus. The Malachim are all Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah. But in that Maimer in Teira Er, where he talks about the Malachim as Eini Hashem, Ozni Hashem, it seems Nira. Doesn't mean it's explicit. It means that the Rebbe Rashab says it's mashma, it's Nira. It seems that he's talking about Malachim of Atzilus. That's when you call them the eyes and ears of Hashem. Like he says in Ageres HaKedesh there, 20, section 20, the Mechitzenis HaKelim, that from the outer containers, the Yud spheres, the Atzilus, of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, Shein Elikus, which of course Atzilus is divine, Nivru HaEcholis, the chambers were created. The Gam, Echolis is one of the levels of, in Ishtalshalis is called Echolis. It's not so relevant to our discussion here. It's just expression against Akedah. But the main thing is the next words. V'gam gufis hamalachim. And also the bodies of the angels. The Atzilus of Atzilus she'en b'chinas yesh. Which, relative to Atzilus, is a level of yesh. So clear in Ageres Akedah, she's calling it gufis hamalachim da Atzilus. Not Biy'a. So based on that, it seems like there's a question. So why are you saying the Shinui and Atzilus is only in Biy'a? There's Malachim and Atzilus, and Eini Hashem, you said that it affects. So it's not just in the levels of the reflection of Malchus after the Parsa, after the partition, into Biy'a, it's on a higher level. So he's not asking as like a kasha, but it's clearly a qualification that he wants to address. And I sense there's a lot going on here. We'll see. Let's see how he answers this. The Yesh Lemer, because you can say, the Ein of Meshetatim, the Ein of Meshetates. So you may recall back there on page 1408. Yeah. So he spoke there about the two levels, Meshetatim and Meshetates. Lashon Zachar, masculine, that the eyes that are gazing, or not gazing, Meshetet, I think we said was scanning. The eyes that scan, that sometimes it says Meshetatim, and sometimes it's Meshetates. Shehem b'chinas tchurin v'nukvin meb'chinas zah u'malchus. That there's two levels. I just want to go back there a minute. I want to just see it inside. Hold on. Yeah. So he said there's Malachim from the world of Nukva Malchus, and Malachim from the world of Tchura masculine, which is Zah. He brings their Teira Er, Ve'erdana. Okay, let's see the connection here. So that's Zah and Malchus. Zah is Tchurin, is the Mashpi, is the masculine, Meshetatim. Malchus is Meshetates. As it says in the Maimer, this Erdana that we just referred to in Teira Er, Hein HaMalachim, they're the Malachim HaMesavim Mebchinas V'chitzenius HaKelim, the Zun da Atzilus. So in other words, he's introducing here, there are Malachim that do not come from the Zivug of Zun and Biy'a. They come from the Zivug. They come from the Chitzenius HaKelim of Zun of Atzilus. And there's two sugim. There's Zah and there's Malchus. Umavur ba'geres HaKedesham. And Ageres HaKedesh, she explains there, the Nishmas HaMalachim Kedim Sheyardu L'Biy'a Einon B'chlal Yesh V'dover B'fnei Atzmei. That the souls of the Malachim, before they descend into Biy'a, they're not considered in the category of separate identity and separate entity. Omnam, however, kasher al yodam nimshach hashgachas b'chinas hamalchus. That's as they are in their root, in their source in Atzilus. But as they serve the role of being the hashgacha b'chinas malchus, of supervising, meaning like the Eini Hashem. So there's their role as they are, so to speak, servants or ambassadors of the king, and they're like imagine not when they're on the job doing their job, but they are in the presence of the king. Then they're not a yesh v'dover b'fnei atzmei. But then, when they're serving their function of the hashgachas b'chinas hamalchus, k'mesher kosev b'da hanal b'inyan b'nei sa'adu, as he explains in that Maimer Erdana, b'nei sa'adu, I have to look up what that means. Harizeh k'mesher yardu l'biyah. That's already as the Malachim descended to Biy'a. So using the example, those very ministers, or you could say even they Vardim, as they are part of the king, so then their role is just simply they are his shluchim. But when they go on their shlichus and they do their function and job, now they have to do their job well. And they have to then engage with whatever it is that their function. So he says, Yesh leima she'oz nasim b'chinas yesh Gam mitznad nishmosam. Then, in that state, they become like a yesh. In a state of yesh, also their soul, not just their body, not just their, well, there's no body no physical body, but not just their keli, but also their neshama. I'm just going to skip the parentheses for practical purposes. And that's why there you can say there's going to be a shinei spell is due to the hashpah shal yodam, due to their function that they're being mashpia now. So in a way, it's something like, I'm just giving an example. When the bodily functions, let's talk the ivarim of the body, the bodily organs and limbs. When a person is asleep, or even if you're awake, but the bodily functions and are not really involved, engaged in anything. Let's say my hands, and I just have them sitting on my side right here. I have my hands. I'm not using them for any particular purpose. So they're an extension of me, and then they sense how they're part of me. But then I sit down to write, and I'm using my hands to write, or to give something, deliver something to someone, or to lift something up. Then that function automatically makes those hands or arms or legs or other limbs are now engaging with whatever it is they have to do. And there's going to be a shinei and a spilus. So he's explaining in a certain way how you can have a level that when it's so-called absorbed in its source, in Atzilus would be the source here, then it's like the source. It's like above shinei and spilus. But when it's engaging in its functions, there you could say it has to engage. If I didn't go out and use my arms and legs to do what I have to do, I won't get it done. But when you do that, I don't want to use the word risk, but that means right away that you could be affected by the experiences, because now that it's very safe to just sit in your little corner and not use your limbs and organs. But once you start using them, then there's going to be engagement with whoever it is that you're engaging or the function that you need to fulfill. And then there could be they're shaykh shinin espilus. That's what he's saying essentially in simple Balbatisha terms. I skipped the parentheses simply because I didn't want to distract. I wanted to just finish the sentence. So I'll just read quickly the parentheses and then I'll stop here. So he says, so they become an yesh. The dafke b'neshamas eme ba'ageres akei sham. The gam la'achar sheyod be'elam azal loy nishtana b'mehusa. And ageres akei says only souls, when they come down below, their personality doesn't change. So even though they do come down below and it's concealed, as we've learned, but the neshamas retain their divine personality. That's because they come from the actually zivug gufni, not zivug ruchni, not zivug neshikin, but zivug gufni, like we learned this earlier, that actually it's not just an embrace, but a zivug gufni would be like the physical intimacy. Here, obviously, it's not physical, but it's a full intimacy in Atzilus. Whereas the malachim, they come from the zivug called neshikin, more like a kiss, not full intimacy. That's just obviously a physical example, but spiritually speaking, it's two levels that create something. So they, Biy'a, nasim b'chinis yesh nivra. They become a yesh nivra, commotion is bar le'il. We learned this earlier on page 1434. So this is the paradox. Malachim on one hand never become really physical because they don't really ever come into a body. But that's precisely because they don't have the ability to do so. Like we learned in the neshamas, because they're rooted in a higher level, they're able to come down lower. But on the other hand, the neshama retains a chelik elikam mal mamish. You don't say that on malachim. So malachim on one hand are God's ambassadors, and they don't even have free will. But they become more of a yesh in that sense. On the other hand, the malachim remain above physical. The neshamas come down, and therefore they become more independent, so to speak, but they retain more of their spiritual divine nature concealed. And they need each other. The malachim help inspire the neshamas, and the neshamas in turn will help elevate the malachim, as we learned earlier. But getting back to our discussion here the main point is that there are two levels with the Shinivi Spilus, and there's a level that's beyond that. So he added that now in the context of the Malachim, that they too have these two levels, and that is where I'll stop here at the end of the paragraph on 1470. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, so we'll stop here. I said yesterday that I wanted to repeat something that I spoke about after we stopped the recording. I don't even remember what it was. Does anyone remember? Thought it was an important point. I said I wanted to get it on record. I don't remember what it was even.
I want to say we were talking about the neshamas, but in some aspect, Naran, I don't know.
No, it was something. No, it was like an afterthought, but it became quite relevant. I forgot what it was. It'll come to me. I'm sure it'll come back to me.
Well, it was a question I asked, and I can't remember it either.
Okay.
So there you have it.
No, it was after the question. It was after the question and answer. Then we started talking about some other topics.
What was the last point we talked about yesterday? Do you remember?
Before the recording ended or after?
Right before the recording ended, because I think it was an extension of that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing.
I don't remember now. Okay.
Where did we leave off? Oh wait, Hadugma was that?
No, but it was something, a point that I really was an important. I remember I felt it should be. I got to just go over it all.
I was just trying to retrace the discussion because that might trigger your thought. That's all I was.
No, I understand. I mean, we finished the end of the. We finished about. Shinin Atzilus. Okay, I will just say one more thing before we conclude here. This is very much a reflection of a major question that the Rebbe Rashab asked in Volume 2, which he's already answered, but it definitely keeps on popping up, a recurrent theme, and that is, how can a post-symptom reality connect with a pre-symptom consciousness? Or the opposite, a post-symptom consciousness with a pre-symptom reality, however you put it. Because the whole existence is contingent on a symptom. If there was no symptom, as the Arizal says, there'd be no room for existence. So how could you say that we can reconnect to pre-symptom reality when all of our existence is based on a symptom? So the answer ultimately was that it's transforming the symptom. The symptom is not an end in itself. It itself is a divine power in order to reveal. And furthermore, Einoid, the symptom itself expresses the divine Helam Ha'atzmi. But that's an additional point. So very much, the end of the story is that post-symptom reality, in general terms, is a world of Shinei and Ispilus. Not completely, because obviously he's talking here Atzilus and Biy'a. But I mean, in general terms, it's a reality that is made possible through the symptom so we can exist and be an independent consciousness. But we wanted to connect to a reality of God that's immutable. The Ein Sof that doesn't leave room for existence, which means that that existence has no effect on it. So in a way, saying that in a world of Shin and Ispilus, which is the divine as it manifests in Biy'a, or even here, the Malachim as they come down, ultimately you want to connect that with the divine that's beyond Shinui. I mean, it's a theme I've repeated several times, which I think we refer to as counterintuitive. So it's actually the other way around. It's not about removing God from us. It's allowing us to experience a God that is removed from us, so to speak. Meaning experiencing God in his pure, pristine form before or beyond his relationship with us. So it's not just God on our terms, it's God on God's terms. So ultimately, that's really what is going on here. So it's a fascinating joining, because it's one thing to say, okay, you know what, we connect with God, because God, like a father, is bending down to us, and he's playing on our terms. You know, we're limited creatures, so we have a finite relationship with the finite dimensions that God is allowing us to access. But the God that is in his own domain, beyond it all, and Yesham Leshanisi, is not reachable. It's not accessible to us. That's not what Chassidus wants. You want Achdus Hashem all the way with the highest levels. For that, you want to preserve the Leshanisi. At the same time, the Leshanisi has created another dimension called Elokus, where there is an impact, like you said, feels the pain, or however the different expressions he used earlier, and ultimately realize that these two divine dimensions are really all one, which is going to be the Yichud of Yichud Tata and Yichud Elah. I just wanted to contextualize it again, and it goes back to the very theme of Lifnei Tzimtzum, the unity of before Tzimtzum and Lifnei Tzimtzum. Not that we reached the Tzimtzum and that's it, and that's our glass ceiling, and we can't go further. That's not correct. We can. And that's a big, big theme in Ayin Beis, because before the Tzimtzum, God planted all the seeds that would be necessary, that would come later. The Sheresh HaGvul, the Sheresh HaBlikvul, Sheresh HaEr, Sheresh HaKelim, they all go back before the Tzimtzum. However, they're not actualized till after the Tzimtzum. And ultimately, we are creating a full, integrated, and seamless union. But of course, this comes after a lot of hard work. That's the thousands of years of Masenu V'Avodesenu. This doesn't happen automatic. This is our work down below, Lamata Lamaila, and Lamaila Lamata, because in many ways, this is ultimately the joining of bottom up and top down. I'm also saying this because I'm in the middle of writing the last chapter of my essay, and I'm connecting it all to the beginning of Ayin Beis. So it's all coming together here. Okay. So that's just a summary of the whole picture. It's not necessarily what I wanted to say yesterday, what I said yesterday, but it's definitely helpful here in the entire discussion. Good. So let's stop here. We're halfway, page 1470, end of the paragraph.